I have this nephew up in Colorado. He's 15 years old, and when something grabs his attention, he really kind of gets into it. I mean, he really dives into it. He surfs the internet, he goes to the library, he asks questions, he really gets into it. About 6 months ago, the topic that he latched onto were questions of faith. Now, my sister is not a regular churchgoer, so it didn't take long before my nephew started asking questions that she couldn't answer. So it occurs to my sister, hey, there's a seminary student in our family. So I start getting all these emails from him. Now, apparently, somewhere in his group of friends, there's an atheist that keeps challenging it. And my nephew is really worried about this. He keeps sending emails asking how should he respond to this? How can he prove the claims of faith? How should he respond to the arguments that God is merely a superstition? Now, obviously, this is not a small question. This is a question that's been debated for centuries and millennia. There are people who have dedicated their lives to coming up with some sort of evidence that can be presented to an impartial observer that would prove or disprove the existence of God. Some sort of experiment or demonstration that would conform to the rules of the scientific method or stand up to forensic cross-examination in court. Now, over the centuries, people have come up with arguments, counter-arguments, rebuttals, answers to those rebuttals, responses, and so on and on and on, and it's all really gotten nowhere. People have pointed to signs and wonders which have just as quickly been rationalized or dismissed as some sort of coincidence. It's like you remember in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. The first ghost that visits Ebenezer Scrooge is his old partner, Jacob Marley, his deceased partner. Marley appears with a howl and these rattling of chains that he has on him. And Dickens writes, "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," says Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your own senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" asked the ghost. "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be a bit of undigested beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more gravy than of brave about you, whatever you are." Now, Dickens tells us that Scrooge has already decided that ghosts don't exist. So he came up with an explanation, a rationalization, that Marley was not a ghost. He was simply an undigested bit of beef. Signs and wonders are easy to explain away. So if signs and wonders can be easily dismissed, what do I tell my nephew? What is the evidence of God? Now, in the Bible, you have the story of Elijah. Now, Elijah was an Old Testament prophet, and Elijah had really hacked off Queen Jezebel. Jezebel was ready to kill him, and she threatened to do so. Now, Jezebel was queen of the northern kingdom of Israel. And this confrontation with Jezebel happened way up there in the north, where that red star is, at a place called Mount Carmel. Well, Elijah, with the queen after him, takes off and he starts running south. And he runs from the northern kingdom of Israel all the way through Judah, which is the purple, all the way down into the Sinai Peninsula, which is that no man's land where the children of Israel wandered for 40 years. Moses took them through the Exodus. And he finally ended up way down at the south, out Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai. That's 400 miles away. And he holed up in a cave. It took him 40 days and 40 nights to get there. And while he was hiding out, the story in 1 Kings tells us, there was a great and strong wind, strong enough to break the rocks. But the Lord was not in the wind. Then there was an earthquake that shook the mountain, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then there was a wildfire, but the Lord was not in the wildfire. Finally there came a gentle whisper, and God spoke. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The wind, the earthquake, the fire, these great signs and wonders could have easily been seen by the impartial observer. These would have been things that could have been documented and measured and presented to a skeptic as proof of God. But the Lord was not in the wind, and the Lord was not in the earthquake, and the Lord was not in the fire. God revealed himself to Elijah in a whisper. Almighty God, the creator of the universe, the one who set the sun and moons in their orbits, who designed the great engines of nature, the weather, the tides, the tectonics, the king of all creation, revealed himself to Elijah in a whisper, a still small voice that only Elijah heard. The wind, the earthquake, and the fire, they all left physical evidence, broken rocks, blown down trees, ashes, solid proof that they'd occurred. But only Elijah heard the whisper. And the only way we know that Elijah heard the whisper is Elijah himself. Elijah bearing witness to his encounter with God. In the reading from today, the disciples are hiding out in Jerusalem. Now, these disciples had had a relationship with Jesus for the past 3 years. And they had seen some signs and wonders. They had seen great miracles. They had seen the power of God working through this man. Stilling of the storm, casting out of demons, even raising Lazarus from the dead. And these are pretty flashy events. But they'd also sat at the foot of the Master, learning the lessons that Jesus had taught. They were witnesses to the good news preached to the poor. They had spent 3 years with the long-awaited Messiah. They had an encounter with God, more than just a whisper. And the world was not going to know anything about it unless they testified to what they had witnessed. But in this story, Jesus has been executed. And it wasn't by the religious authorities. Under the deal that the Jewish King Herod had cut with the Roman authorities, the Jews had the right to enforce their own laws. I mean, the Romans had not just taken over Israel. They cut this kind of deal in the background. But the Jewish method of executing was stoning. Remember St. Stephen, he was stoned. Jesus had been crucified. Now, crucifixion was reserved only by the Romans. And it was a Roman method of execution that was reserved specifically for insurrectionists. Whatever games the Jewish leaders had played with Pilate, the bottom line was that Jesus had been executed as an enemy of the state, as an enemy of the Roman Empire. And if Jesus was a rebel leader, what did that make the disciples? And this is why they were hiding out. They were worried if they were going to be next. Now, we see this in the story of Doubting Thomas, which is told a little bit earlier. The story starts out when it was the evening of that day, and remember, the story of Doubting Thomas happens Easter afternoon. The resurrection happened in the morning. This was in the afternoon. It was the evening of that day, the first day of the week, and all the doors of the house of the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews. Even though Jesus was resurrected, things were not back to normal. They were not about to walk out in the open like they used to. Now they were outlaws. Now the power of the Roman state no longer considered Jesus this insignificant wandering preacher way off in a minor province. Now the encounter that the disciples had with Christ, the testimony to the teachings that they had learned, and the events that they had witnessed was in real danger of being lost.